Very well, we'll soon be ready for our next witness. Let me mention a couple of things. With respect to the proposal for recording these proceedings and the local rule change, all of the responses that have been received are arrayed in the jury room. Counsel may inspect them. I filed those that came from organizations. These are lawyer organizations, I believe exclusively, but did not file the individual comments because of their numerosity. I'll be pleased to receive whatever suggestions counsel have with respect to how we deal with those. And with respect to a letter dated January 11th that I received from Mr. Cooper concerning the seating arrangement and the direction that the camera is, that is focusing on counsel, is pointed at, that he expressed concern that he and members of his team could be observed in the background conferring. I fixed the situation now, and you're seated on the other side of the table. And I hope that's no disappointment to you, Mr. Cooper, but you cannot be observed. You're out of camera range, so you can consult with your colleagues without fear of being picked up on camera. All right, Mr. Boies, you taking the next witness?
No, Your Honor. The next witness is Professor George Chauncey. He's a witness that has some issues that are particular to the city and county of San Francisco, and also some issues that are broader. So in order to make the presentation most efficient and avoid having multiple lawyers examine each for separate parties, we've agreed that counsel for the city and county of San Francisco will do the entire examination.
That would be fine. I assume that's without objection, Mr. Thompson?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Your Honor. We would like to call the plaintiffs, and the plaintiff interveners would like to call Professor George Chauncey to the stand.
Raise your right hand, please. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. State your name, please.
George Chauncey,
And spell your last name.
C-H-A-U-N-C-E-Y.
And your first name.
George.
Good afternoon, Professor Chauncey. You are here as an expert. I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about the source and the nature of your expertise. Would you tell us what academic degrees you hold?
Yes, I have a BA, an MA, a master's in philosophy, and a PhD in history, all from Yale University. The PhD was in 1989.
What academic positions have you held?
I had a one-year postdoctoral fellowship at Rutgers University, and then a one-year assistant professorship at New York University. And then I taught for 15 years at the University of Chicago. The first several years started as an assistant professor of history, and about the last 10 years was full professor of history. And then 3.5 years ago, I moved to Yale, where I'm a professor of history and American studies.
Would you tell us about the books you've authored or edited?
One is called Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, 1890 to 1940. That was published in 1994. Another is Why Marriage? The History of Shaping Today's Debate Over Gay Equality. It was published in 2004. Also, I co-edited a book called Hidden from History, which was an early collection of essays in lesbian and gay history. And I'm currently working on finishing a book about post-war gay culture in politics.
Would you also tell us a little bit about the other kinds of academic publications you've authored?
I've published something more than a dozen articles and scholarly journals and collections.
And how about conference papers?
And I've given many conference papers and chaired sessions at the major professional meetings of the American Historical Association, Organization of American Historians, American Studies Association, and have been invited to give lectures across the United States and Europe, Latin America, China, and Australia.
Have you received any awards for your scholarly work?
Gay New York, which was my dissertation at Yale, received 2 awards there. One was for the co-winner of the Best Prize for Best Dissertation in American History, and then it won the university's top dissertation prize for a dissertation in any department. And then as a book, it won 2 awards from the Organization of American Historians. One was for the first best book in any field of history, and the other was for the best book published in the previous 2 years in American social history. It won the Los Angeles Los Angeles Times Book Prize and a couple of other prizes.
Would you tell us a little bit about the kinds of sources that you study in the work that you do in your research and writing and your teaching?
Well, as a social historian, I draw very widely from sources. So I've looked at court records, police records, probation department records, records of various private moral reform societies, records of gay organizations, social service agencies. I've also looked at diaries, correspondence. I've interviewed, actually sort of lost track, but I think it's about 180 elderly gay men about their experiences. I've also looked at films, advertising, so forth. The sorts of things that I also teach in my teaching. Of course, I assign a range of studies by historians and other scholars, and then primary documents, which would be drawn from all these fields, as well as films. I often teach films in my classes and teach students how to interpret them in the context of the historical period.
How about government or political materials?
Well, in addition to the records of the courts and the police I've mentioned, I've looked at congressional records and reports, publications put up on mayor's offices, and their correspondence and so forth.
Would you just quickly describe for the court the kinds of courses that you've taught, summarizing, given the 20-year history of your teaching?
Sure. Broadly, courses in the 20th century American history, the broadest being a 2-semester lecture course on the United States since 1919. And then more specialized courses on post-World War II American culture in society, urban history, social history, the history of gender and sexuality. Lesbian and gay history is a lecture course and is a seminar.
Your Honor, we would like to offer Professor Chauncey in the subjects that he just described, that is, in the history of 20th century U.S. history broadly, but with specialization in gender and sexuality, and the social, cultural, and political history of lesbian and gay men and their place in American society.
Mr. Thompson.
We have no objection, Your Honor.
Very well, you may proceed, Ms. Stewart.
Dr. Chauncey, before we go into the substance or the details, if you will, of your opinions, could you just give the court a brief summary of the expert opinions that you're going to offer the court today?
Well, most broadly, I guess, my reading of the historical record is that lesbians and gays and gay men have experienced widespread and acute discrimination from both public and private authorities over the course of the 20th century. And that has continuing legacies and effects. This has been manifested in the criminalization of sexual intimacy and association, the discrimination in public accommodations and employment, censorship of images about gay people and speech by gay activists, stereotypes and demonization of lesbians and gay men, and that all this has been drawn on and reinforced sustained patterns of prejudice and hostility.
I'd like to turn then to the first of those things that you mentioned, criminalization. Could you tell us, give me an example of one of the major ways that gay people have been criminalized?
Well, the first obvious example would be sodomy laws. Although there is a complicated history there, they were enacted in one form or another in the early American colonies. Typically, they didn't specify homosexual conduct and only homosexual conduct, though some of the Puritan colonies did actually just quote Leviticus, prohibiting man from lying with a man. But very often they prohibited a range of non-procreative forms of sexual intercourse between men and men, men and women, men and animals in some cases. They also didn't criminalize all forms of homosexual conduct. Relatively few of them criminalized female interactions, for instance. But these laws were reformulated after independence, changed over the course of the late 19th century. They were enforced more in the colonial period and then relatively little for some period after that. Enforcement increased in the late 19th century, and then even then, they often focused on particular kinds. Certainly, some people who engaged in consensual homosexual relations were prosecuted. They typically went after sex with minors, sex involving violence, and so forth. What's striking about the development of those laws over the course of the 20th century is that even though they were broadly construed, of course, they came to symbolize the criminalization of homosexual sex in particular. Ironically, this was probably most striking in the Supreme Court's decision in Bowers v. Hardwick, where they were deciding about a Georgia statute which actually criminalized anal and oral sex between men and women, heterosexuals as well as homosexuals, and yet they described the case as if it were simply bearing on homosexual sex. And I think that broadly, that's been a way that sodomy has come to be understood. And of course, some of the laws did penalize just same-sex. And in the 1960s, and especially 70s, as more and more states decriminalized sodomy as part of their general reform of the moral code, several states actually enacted new legislation that specified homosexual conduct, such as the Texas statute.
Were there other ways besides the sodomy laws that gay people have been criminalized as you have used that term?
Well, beginning again in the late 19th century, when you have the emergence of highly developed and more visible lesbian and gay subcultures in large American cities, there was a stepped-up policing of those communities and people. And the police began to enforce a range of laws that didn't specifically mention homosexuality, but could be used against. And I will give you just one example. The disorderly conduct statute, as of course a very broad rubric, can be used by the police and courts to penalize a wide range of behavior that they consider disorderly. And in New York City, which I've studied, although there are comparable laws in California, we can see that these laws began to be applied more and more to homosexuals. The disorderly conduct statute began to be applied more and more to homosexuals, and actually at some point the police started registering disorderly conduct, parentheses, degenerate, in their own police record books. And then in 1923 or 24, the New York State Legislature specified as a form of disorderly conduct one person standing around in public place for purposes of soliciting a man for unnatural sexual acts. So in this law was then used both certainly to literally criminalize one man trying to pick up another man, to ask him to have sex, but was also used to arrest people who were found in a bar or a club or a restaurant. Sometimes it was used against people who were simply found at a gay party in a private home. And over the course of a period from 1924 to 1966, when New York's Mayor John Lindsay stopped the police from using entrapment to enforce this law, there were approximately 50,000 arrests under this charge. And the scale of this, I guess, came home to me when at some point when I interviewed 75 or 100 gay men, actually counted up and realized that half of them had been arrested at least once on a gay-related charge in their lives. And this was the most common charge, so it was really a very pervasive form of policing.
You mentioned New York, and I take it that was just an example. Did this happen elsewhere?
Yes, there was a similar law in California. The vagrancy law was often used in California, and those sorts of laws, general purpose laws, were sort of tailored to deal with homosexuals in a variety of states.
What effects did the discrimination of gay people, of which you've given these examples, have on gay people?
Well, I think one effect was simply to register the society's disapproval of their behavior and to make that abundantly clear. And the idea, especially this idea that sodomy laws were anti-homosexual laws, has been used in recent years to justify a range of forms of discrimination. You couldn't let openly gay sailors serve in the military because, or soldiers rather, serve in the military because what they do, what defines them in some sense as being homosexual, is a criminal offense. It was mobilized in some of the anti-gay rights referenda of recent decades. But it stood as a sign of social disapproval for homosexuals. And then, of course, it just had palpable effects on people's lives. As I said, it meant that a phenomenal number of people, at one point or another, ran across the law, and they knew that the police were out looking for them.
Did some people, did it affect their willingness to go out and be in public?
It did for some. There were certainly many very bold people who went out and about, went to gay meeting places, certainly developed gay social networks and the like. But at times when there were police crackdowns, and periodically this would happen in major cities, even small towns around the country, and the heat was on, as it were, people were then much more likely to be careful about going out and associating, especially...
What, if you did get arrested?
Well, one of the biggest fears, disorderly conduct itself, of course, is not that significant misdemeanor, but it opened up much more consequential dangers to people. So both the lawyers I've talked with who have represented men who had been charged this way, and some of the men I've interviewed who faced these charges, all agree that their first concern was the fact that they had been arrested on this would lead the police to call their relatives to confirm their identity, call their landlord to confirm their address, call their employer to confirm their workplace. And so the biggest fear really was that this would expose them as being gay, and that would lead to much more much more significant social consequences. The loss of a job or a home or social respect, rip ties with their families.
And did it lead to those kinds of losses, in fact?
It certainly did. Sometimes, yes.
You mentioned as the second topic or item that you were going to discuss today was discrimination, is I think the word that you used. And I wondered if you could describe the discrimination or give some examples of the discrimination that has been perpetrated on gay people.
Right. I was going to discuss discrimination in public accommodations and employment. Start with public accommodations. Probably one of the most important instances of this was the fact that in 1933, with the repeal of Prohibition, first New York State, and then successively many other states issued regulations that prohibited bars from serving, bars, restaurants, cabarets, or any place with a liquor license from serving drinks to lesbians or gay men, or allowing them to congregate on the premises. And this, of course, had just a profound impact on lesbian and gay sexuality, sociability for lesbian and gay men, as well as for heterosexuals. Bars and restaurants were places to go to meet your friends, to socialize. But they were particularly important for lesbians and gay men because they had to be so careful to hide their gay identities in so many of those social settings, at the workplace, often with their biological families and so forth, so that they were really keen to find places where they could go and be more open, just socialize with people of their own kind. And what it meant was that this criminalization, that when people went to a regular bar or a restaurant, a normal bar or a restaurant, they typically had to be very careful to hide the fact that they were gay for fear of being excluded. And so they often sought out places that they had decided would make more money with the snitch market, would pay higher prices for drinks. So there were so few places where they could go and be open. But those places, to survive, had to pay bribes to the police, and often to organize criminal syndicates, which had relationships with the police or were even run by organized criminal syndicates. So it meant that gay life was just enmeshed in a web of criminality because of the criminalization of gay and lesbian sociability.
Did any of the bars sort of explicitly exclude people in light of the law? How did they do that? Well,
they did it in a range of ways. Certainly bartenders in a normal bar, quote unquote, if they realized that someone was gay, would simply 86 them, as they put it, refuse to serve them a drink. They'd tell them they're 86th and they have to leave the bar, which would be quite embarrassing. I have interviewed people who have had the experience in front of their friends and found it really humiliating. But then in the lesbian and gay bars themselves, particularly, well, actually, not just in those. In bars in neighborhoods with a gay population or gay reputation, bar owners sometimes put a sign over the bar itself that would say, and I've heard various signs described, and I've seen it in the literature, if you are gay, please stay away, or it is against the law to serve homosexuals. Please do not ask us to serve homosexuals. And so this conveyed a very clear message to both gay and straight customers that homosexuals were a despised category to be excluded. And they were also a part, they were also part of the way the bars tried to protect themselves from the police to show that they were being vigilant to exclude gay people.
So how did the authorities enforce those laws?
Well, the beauty of liquor licensing and the licensing system is that it meant that a small business owner who ran a bar had to get a license to sell, or a restaurant, cabaret, had to get a license to sell liquor. and to enforce the regulations imposed by whatever the liquor authority was, and knew that he or she always risked losing that license and really losing that investment if the liquor authority realized that they were not enforcing those regulations. So, first of all, the licensing system itself meant that every single bar had a staff that was trying to make sure that the bar would not get in trouble. But secondly, local patrolmen would step in periodically and would sort of look in and see what was happening in your place and make sure it wasn't disorderly. And then the liquor authorities themselves had a staff of special investigators who would go undercover into the restaurants and bars and so forth, just to make sure that a range of regulations were being followed, including the prohibition against serving homosexuals. They then, if they saw them, would report this, and this would lead to the closure of the place.
Did other authorities besides the police, the local police or the liquor authorities, get involved in that policing effort?
Well, bars that were close to military bases, certainly in the big cities during the war, were also put under surveillance by a sort of coalition task force of military officials and police officials, because the military was quite keen to make sure that its sailors and soldiers were not going to such places. So they joined with the police in investigating them, had their off-limits list, and tried to get places closed. So other forces were brought in.
So if you were a police officer and you were enforcing this effort, or a military person, how did you know the bar was serving gay people?
Well, it's a good question. There were major techniques, two major techniques that were used. One was to record, take note of an act of one man picking up another man. And it was usually a man in this case, since that was a sure sign that homosexuals were there. So that what the police and the liquor authority agents did was to send plainclothes policemen into the bars who would strike up conversations with customers, lead them on, and then at some point, when an invitation was issued to leave the bar and to go home, bring out the handcuffs and arrest them. So that would lead to the arrest of the bar goer, and they would also be the best proof possible that homosexuals were at the bar. And so it would then be reported, and it would lead to the proceedings that would then revoke the liquor license. The other way that was used, and I've seen this in a bunch of court records, where a bar has resisted, has tried to challenge the revocation of the license, the police would actually point to a stereotypical gender behavior or cross-gender behavior that was associated with lesbians and gay men, and use that as evidence that a bar was patronized by them. So, for instance, a policewoman might report that she had seen two women dancing together, or women with short hair, or women who were wearing some articles of masculine clothing, or women who seemed to swagger around the bar in a way that was more masculine than a woman should walk. Or likewise, they would point to men whose clothing was just a little too unconventional, a little too colorful, whose hair was too long, who addressed each other in effeminate ways. The most startling example to me was sort of one of the signs the police officer gave that a bar was gay was that he had overheard two men talking about the opera, something that no real man would talk about in the 1950s. So there was just a range of ways, sort of unconventional behavior, gender behavior, stereotypically associated with lesbians and gay men that was used to identify them. I think it's actually kind of striking thing, because one of the clearest examples of how the policing of homosexuality has been used in very specific legal sense, and then broadly and culturally, to police gender norms, so that actually people who went into bars, who behaved in unconventional ways, cross-gendered ways, could be suspected of being homosexual. And a bar might push them out for that very reason.
Did any of the bars or restaurants where the liquor authorities tried to enforce the law resist or endeavor to fight the charge?
Yes, some did. I'd have to say that most just closed quietly because they realized that they weren't going to be able to beat this charge. But many did try, either by appealing to the liquor authority itself or going to the courts. Usually the first line of defense was simply that they didn't know, they couldn't be expected to know that there were gay people there. Thus the signs, it's against the law. You know, don't ask us to break the law. But periodically people did pose a challenge to the idea of this law, that you could actually discriminate against a class of people on the basis of their homosexual status. And in both New York State and in California, in the 1950s, there were rulings by the state's highest court that invalidated that kind of discrimination. So a famous case in California, the Black Cat Cafe here in San Francisco, which lost its license, I think around 1949, filed a suit. And it got a state Supreme Court ruling in '51 that said you couldn't discriminate that way. And then for several years, there was relative peace and quiet for bars in San Francisco. And then the San Francisco Police Department started a campaign against homosexuals, 54, 55, sweeps of streets and parks, crack down on bars. In '55, the state legislature circumvented that ruling by passing a law that outlawed bars or restaurants that became what it called resorts for sex perverts. And the Alcoholic Beverage Commission, which was just then established, then launched a campaign against such bars and restaurants, which led to many more being closed. Finally, there was one other state Supreme Court ruling that said, no, they meant it, you couldn't do this. And nonetheless, Mayor George Christopher here in San Francisco had a tough re-election campaign in '59. And his opponent had charged that he had allowed San Francisco to become a mecca for homosexuals. And he was so determined to show it wasn't true that once he was reelected, he launched a 2-year-long campaign against gay life in the city, which led to, by one historian's account, 40 to 60 arrests a week, and about a third of the bars being shut down.
After the Supreme Court ruling?
After this ruling. And after that, things slowed down in San Francisco, but there continued to be such raids in Los Angeles. So
when did these sorts of bar raids and, this kind of activity end?
Well, they continued periodically, even in places where they had been ruled unconstitutional. Most famously, of course, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village in New York. After, in fact, the courts had already ruled that it was legitimate to serve lesbians and gay men. In that case, they were going after mob-oriented bars. These raids periodically happened, certainly in San Francisco and in LA, into the 60s and 70s, later in LA. And actually last summer in Fort Worth, Texas, police went into a bar and arrested 7 of its patrons. And there was quite a controversy about that. So obviously the number of such events has dramatically fallen off, but it happened at very different rates across the country.
So can you describe the effects of that practice of basically shutting down places where gay people gathered on gay people?
Well, it just meant that, again, that they had, it was one more way to be conveyed to them that they were a despised class of people, a group of outlaws in the eyes of the law, and that they had to take great care in protecting or keeping secret the fact that they were gay. And I think, and I said this already, but it sort of more broadly helped, not just for gay people, but sort of for the public at large, associated gay life with criminality. There were often periodically campaigns against gay bars, and they talked about the police corruption that was required to keep these bars going. And instead of pointing to the criminalization of them as a predicate of that, they talked about gay bars as corruptors of the police. And it contributed to the growing sense on the part of many people that gay people were dangerous and a part of the violent, seedy, violent criminal underworld.
So earlier you mentioned you were going to talk about employment discrimination and give some examples of that. Can you turn to that subject now?
Sure. I guess the first striking example I'd mention is in the military itself. There had been various regulations affecting homosexual conduct and homosexuals in the military before the Second World War, but it was really at the beginning of the Second World War that, for the first time, facing the necessity of mobilizing literally millions of people very quickly to fight the war, that the military decided to absolutely exclude all homosexuals and to institute screening procedures that would keep homosexuals out. And so this became a part of the induction process, the screening process for everyone who was volunteered or drafted to serve in the war. Not surprisingly, they didn't ferret out many people, despite this policy. I think it was only 5,000 or 6,000. Most young gay people, like their heterosexual peers, were deeply concerned to defend the country in the face of the Japanese and German attacks. And they found ways. they were quite accustomed at this point to find ways to pass as straight. So they got passed through. And of course, people in smaller towns were afraid that if their selective service board learned that they were gay, word would spread very quickly to their families and to their neighbors about this. So they were very concerned to keep that hidden. But the military was sort of aware of this, and so it had various procedures in place to try to discover homosexuals and discharge homosexuals during the war. And actually, the discharges increased during the period of demobilization at the end of the war, when the manpower needs were not quite so pressing. And this regulation, well, in one form or another, is continuing to the present day.
So what happened to soldiers who had served but were discharged at some point along the way for being gay?
Well, first, of course, they faced the stigma of not serving in the military, not serving their country. And those who were not allowed into the military, if you were a man of a certain age and you weren't in the military or a critical defense industry, then people had questions about why you weren't. And so this was really humiliating to people. And then people who were either kept out or were discharged, actually, including people who had served in combat who were discharged, were then denied benefits under the GI Bill after the end of the war. And of course, the GI Bill was just a phenomenally important piece of social engineering in the post-war years, rather. It gave virtually an entire generation of young men privileged access to education, financial support for continuing their education, preferential access to jobs, helps in buying homes. A lot of the post-war suburban building boom was financed through the GI Bill. It had profound consequences, and it meant that homosexuals who were kept out of the military or discharged as homosexuals were prohibited from getting those benefits. And so in many ways were kept from that citizenship right.
And what about the several thousand that were ferreted out, I think is the word you used? I know you mentioned that there could be, that they could be found out by family members or people in their towns, but did it affect their ability to, sort of participate as Americans in any way in our society?
Well, sort of at the most basic practical level, in the early days, especially after the war, people wanted to see your discharge papers when they were going to hire you, very often. And they would see that that was what you were discharged for. And that was not a very good thing if you were looking for a job. I think, in a way, it also had a sort of and it certainly impressed upon people that they were being denied their membership in the community and their citizenship, really. And I think in some way it really conveyed that to the whole country. I mean, the war was such an important moment in bringing people together and bringing together people who had been really divided during the First World War. There had been a lot of demonization of Catholics during the war and a lot of anti-Semitism in the First World War, that is. And the Second World War really brought this. I mean, think of the kind of classic movies that come out of World War II, and you've got the Jew from Brooklyn and the Irish guy from Chicago and the Italian from San Francisco, and homosexuals were not a part of that group. There was really a profound way in which gay people were being excluded from the cultural image of the nation.
And you said, I think earlier, that the policy has continued in one way or another to this day. But I wonder if you could explain what don't ask, don't tell, what that policy did.
Well, of course, President Clinton, as a candidate, had promised to repeal the prohibition on lesbians and gay men serving in the military. And then when he assumed the presidency, there was such a firestorm of opposition to that on the parts of the leadership of the military and grassroots groups across the country that he retreated from that and produced a compromise. Don't ask, don't tell. Which theoretically said that so long as gay people didn't tell the fact that they were gay, the military wouldn't go around asking if they were. In fact, it didn't quite work out that way. People were found out, and something like about 9,500 people were discharged in the first decade of the policy of don't ask, don't tell.
Were there, let me just ask it this way, what were the effects on the country of its exclusion of gay people from military service, either more recently or in the past?
Well, as a number of people have pointed out, it meant that the country lost the services of patriotic citizens who wanted to join their country's defenses. And so, you know, in some cases, those were quite important services. There's been a lot of attention given recently to a number of people who have been discharged who were translators of Arabic, something pretty important right now. But broadly, it meant that the country lost the services of large groups of people and had the financial cost associated with that of recruiting people to take their place and training of people to take their place.
I'd like to ask you now to look at the plaintiff's exhibit that's marked 872 in your binder, if you would.
Would that be this binder?
I think it would be.
This is Cott's direct binder. These are Nancy Cott's binders.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Have we given the court, sorry, Your Honor.
This is PX 872.
Yes, Your Honor.
The
872
the thin one?
in the fat binder.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Dr. Chauncey, are you familiar with this report?
Yes. This is a report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office to congressional requesters, and it's titled Military Personnel Financial Cost and Loss of Critical Skills Due to the Department of Defense's Homosexual Conduct Policy Cannot Be Completely Estimated.
Have you reviewed this report?
I have looked at this report.
Does this report indicate at least some of the costs that the military incurred by virtue of the don't ask, don't tell policy?
Yes. It estimates that over the first 10-year period of enforcement of the policy, they estimated that it may have cost the Department of Defense around $95 million in 2004 dollars to recruit replacements for service members separated under the policy. And they estimated it cost approximately another $95 million to train their replacements.
Your Honor, I would like to move this document into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
872 will be admitted.
So, Professor Chauncey, besides the discrimination in employment in the military, was there any other employment discrimination, or can you give another example of employment discrimination that was significant in our country's history?
Well, after the Second World War, the employment of homosexuals in the civilian sectors of employment also became a major issue. And in 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy announced that he knew the names not only, or that he had a list of names not only of communists in the State Department and other agencies, but of sex perverts. This led to a couple of congressional committees investigating the charge. And one of them, a standing committee, subcommittee, which produced a report called On the Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government in 1950. And this report surveyed, was based on investigation on the way the government was dealing with this problem, and took note of the fact that checking Civil Service Commission records, they found that since this had become more of an issue in 1947, 2.5 years that they looked at, some 1,700 people had been prohibited from getting civilian jobs because it had been discovered that they were homosexual. They were concerned that the procedures for identifying homosexuals were inadequate and for ferreting them out and discharging them, so they recommended a tightening of procedures. And in 1953, shortly after Dwight Eisenhower became president, one of his first executive orders decreed that that homosexuals would be prohibited from civilian as well as military employment in the federal government. And it actually also required private companies which had contracts with the government to ferret out and fire their homosexual employees.
Well, first, let me ask you, how did the McCarthy Senate's treatment of gay people in their investigation compare to their treatments of communists?
Well, they gave a lot of attention, of course, to communists, and were quite concerned about communist infiltration into the State Department, in particular, and other agencies of the government. But the historian who's done the closest study of this policy estimates that at the height of the McCarthy period in the 1950s, the State Department actually dismissed more homosexuals than communists.
I'd like to ask you, Dr. Chauncey, to look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 2337. I think it's towards the end of your binder.
Okay.
Can you identify that exhibit for the court?
Yes.
2337?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. This is the report I mentioned, employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in government.
Your Honor, I would like to move this document into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
2337 is admitted.
Turning for a minute to the, we'll come back to that one at a later point, but I wanted to turn to President Eisenhower's executive order. I think you said it required that employees who were in the federal government who were found out to be gay would be discharged. And I think, did I understand also not hiring?
Right.
When did that policy end?
That policy ended for most federal agencies in 1975 when President Carter rescinded that policy, though it continued to be in effect for some of the highly sensitive intelligence agencies and so forth. And it was only in the 1990s that President Clinton both ended the policy bearing on intelligence agencies and also prohibited discrimination in federal government employment.
Can you explain the difference between what President Carter did and what,
Sure.
besides the scope?
Right. So basically, President Carter said that the federal agencies were no longer required to dismiss their homosexual employees or keep homosexuals from their employ. And then President Clinton enacted an anti-discrimination order that they could not discriminate. So in that intervening period, agencies were not required to discriminate, but they could discriminate.
Was the discrimination in public employment limited to the federal government?
No. There, across the country, state governments took up this issue in a variety of ways, tried to institutionalize employment discrimination against lesbians and gay men. Just give you one example. In the late 50s, state legislature had a legislative investigation committee which launched an investigation of homosexuals in the state university system, which eventually led to the firing of more than a dozen members of the faculty and other staff. And I think more than 300 people were interrogated over the course of that investigation, which lasted several years. And so there were a variety of ways that this sort of campaign was carried out at the state level. And at the city level, I've seen in my own research, for instance, the welfare department in New York City had to fire several of its welfare workers in 1950s when it was brought to their attention that they had been discovered as being gay.
Did the mandated discrimination in the federal government or other government affect access to jobs for gay people in the private sector?
Well, as I said, President Eisenhower's executive order required private companies with government contracts to ferret out and fire their homosexual employees. I would say that more broadly, though, gay people faced customary discrimination and from a range of employers. And so it was the degree of the enforcement of this varied from occupation to occupation, company to company. But certainly, most people realized that they had to be very careful to hide their homosexuality at the workplace for fear of losing their jobs.
Did employment discrimination in any sector, private, public, federal, state, what have you, limit gay people's job choices or channel them into particular professions?
Well, of course, we have no real statistical evidence to base this on, but I would say that based on the interviews I've done, that certainly there were a good number of gay people who just took the risk and pursued the profession they wanted or the line of work they wanted, and they did what they needed to hide their identities at work. But there were also a good number of people who just didn't want to risk that. They didn't want to have to put up with that. So in effect, sort of funneled into other kinds of low-status jobs where people were less likely to care they were gay. Someone who was sort of stereotypically associated with gay people even today, but being a waiter, being a hairdresser, taking on being a low-level clerical worker, kinds of niches in the employment sector where people felt they could be somewhat safer.
So what were the effects of this widespread discrimination in employment on gay people generally?
Well, I guess I'd have to say broadly that it meant that gay life really was being pushed underground, indeed, and sort of everything I've described so far. And I think some people interpret that to mean that there was very little organized gay life at all, and that's simply not the case. There were, in fact, meeting places. There were parties in private apartments. People did have a gay social life, but they had to be very, very careful to hide it. And although this has already been true in the 20th century, most people didn't want to take this risk. It really increased the stakes for people, and so it meant that they really became sort of a world within a world. It was very secretive, had its own codes, so that people could talk with one another without alerting outsiders. Actually, the word gay itself is probably the best example of this. Gay liberationists in the 1970s were determined to bring gay people out of the closet. So they called themselves gay liberationists. But in the 1940s and the 1950s and early 60s, very few straight people realized that gay people, homosexuals, had given gay a sort of homosexual meaning. So that a lesbian standing at the office water cooler could say to another woman that she had gone to a gay place the night before, or had a gay time, met a gay gal, and really communicate quite a lot to the person she was talking to without worrying that someone next to her would overhear this and understand what was going on. But it just meant that there was a level of secrecy required. Of course, this also meant that fewer heterosexuals, or relatively fewer heterosexuals, thought that they really knew gay people. And the context of this is a variety of studies have shown a sort of ignorance. A lack of contact with people has increased this prejudice. So it's easier for demonic stereotypes to develop of gay people, given that real living gay people had to be so careful to hide themselves.
Or should I say, has the discrimination in employment in the state and local public arena ended?
No, it hasn't ended. It's certainly, I think it's clear that it has lessened since the 1950s, and there have been a series of laws passed at the local and state level that prohibit such discrimination. There are a lot of complaints of such discrimination brought under those laws, but there's still, I believe, these are the right figures, 20 states that do not prohibit discrimination in public employment, and another 28 that don't prohibit in private employment.
The third area that you mentioned you talk about today was censorship. And I'm wondering if you could explain what you mean when you said that gay people have been subject to censorship.
Well, one of the most significant examples of this would be the censorship of the representation of homosexuality in the movies. In the early 30s, there was a mass censorship campaign led by a group called the Legion of Decency, led by Catholic leaders with Jewish and Protestant support, which was concerned about what they considered to be the immorality of Hollywood films. This was, of course, very early in the history of Hollywood and the film industry. And so they pressured the Hollywood studios to enact some sort of censorship code, which it eventually did, in order to try to forestall federal censorship. And then in 1937, under more pressure, they really started enforcing this code with the Production Code Authority. And this code imposed certain rules on how certain delicate issues could be dealt with: crime, adultery. These could be represented, but in certain ways. Usually crime had to pay, etc. The offender needed to be punished. But there were certain things that they prohibited from being included in the movies at all. For instance, interracial relationships were absolutely forbidden from being represented. And lesbian and gay characters, or the discussion of homosexuality, or even, as the code put it, the inference of sex perversion was prohibited. So that meant that for a generation, until the code began to fall apart in the late 50s and early 60s, Hollywood films, the dominant medium of the mid-20th century, could not include gay characters, could not explore gay lives.
You mentioned that the code was enforced, got more enforced, I think you said in 1934? How was it enforced?
The Hollywood studios were required to submit their scripts to the Production Code Administration, the Hayes office, which would review the scripts and bring to their attention anything that they thought was problematic. So there would often be a back and forth. I've read some of these exchanges, a back and forth between the studios and the Production Code about exactly what could or could not be included. So it wasn't kind of general informal regulation. It was strictly managed.
Did the Hayes Code affect television?
The Hayes Code itself didn't. But in some ways, there was even more concern about television in its early years. Television expanded very rapidly into American homes in the early 1950s. But in those days, way before cable, there were, only a handful of networks. Most people had access to just 2 or 3 stations. So there was a lot of concern about what it meant to bring that into the home, where children might see things that parents wouldn't necessarily be able to supervise. So the television networks were actually much more constrained than even Hollywood in dealing with certain issues, so that there were very few characters who could even be hinted at as being gay in the first several decades of television. And there began to be, certainly there was some discussion of homosexuality that began to increase in really just the 1980s. And as recently as 1989, so just over 20 years ago, a very popular TV series called 30-something did actually have a scene written in where it showed 2 men in bed together with the sheets, pulled up to here for about 15 seconds. And this was so shocking that various organizations, various religious conservative religious organizations, organized boycott threats. And the sponsors withdrew from that segment. And a lot of local affiliates either didn't show it at all or they bumped it out of prime time to midnight. And that sort of briefly put a chilling effect on the inclusion of gay characters. But by the mid-90s, the numbers had begun to increase. And as recently as 1996, it was so astonishing that Ellen DeGeneres would come out as a lesbian, as a character on her show, and as a person, that it put her on the cover of Time magazine. The idea was so, it's almost, for the young people who might hear this, probably impossible to believe that this was the case. But this was sort of the way for several generations that people just did not have gay characters in a major media of their culture.